Well, howdy there, Matt here with Grafted Branch Homestead, and in today's video I'm going to show you one of the ways we store and preserve food for long-term storage. In today's video we're talking dry canning. What is it, why would you do it, and is it safe? If you like prepping, homesteading, self-sufficiency, and a more natural way of doing things, hit the subscribe button below and check out our channel for more. So my goal here is to show you just one of the ways we do it. However, I would encourage you to do your own research, as I am not a professional and I'm only showing you one way we do things. Go ahead and do your own research, make sure it's safe for what you're doing and for you. Today we're talking dry canning. There's a lot of controversy or a lot of talk, I guess, around canning in general, and specifically dry canning on the internet. Is it safe? What is it? Why would you do it? And so in today's video, I'm hoping to address a lot of those issues. I want to be very real with you, tell you why we do it, and give you a lot of the pros and cons to it. So first of all, dry canning. Pretty simple. It's canning dried goods in a dry jar, in a dry oven, in a dry environment, for most likely long-term storage. If you're storing food in bulk, or you're getting into it often, or it's in bulk for long-term storage, you're probably going to use another means of storing your dried goods, such as these Mylar bags or Gamma lid 5-gallon pails. But another way you can do it is dry canning it in a mason jar. Now, this isn't actually canning, so let me go ahead and throw that out there right away. It's not done in water, in a pressure sealer and all that like traditional canning. However, it is a way you can store it. There's a lot of controversy, and when I say that, it is mostly around whether it's safe or not. And that is because with canning, any type of canning, there's certain concerns you can have. And one of the biggest ones is things that can develop in it, such as botulism. And so we're going to address that a little bit. But really all dry canning is canning dried goods in the dry oven, in the dry jar. You're going to want to can goods that are almost completely dry already though. So when dry canning, some of the things that you can would be like beans, dried beans of all sorts. You can do dried rice. Even some dried goods like these crackers will work. Some of the things that you probably don't want to can would be things like dog food maybe, or nuts because of their high oil content. You don't want to can anything that's wet. And the reason being there is with dry canning, it must be food that is below 10% in its water level and its moisture level. So these beans and things are already quite a bit below. If it has a higher moisture content or oil content to it and you try and dry can it, the odds are you may get botulism. It's a lot higher that you can have something go wrong. And so botulism really takes flight when it needs some moisture and an anaerobic environment. So when you have a little bit of that, that's when you can develop things. So that's one of the big concerns with it. Another one is you're dry canning it in these jars. It's obviously not going to be for bulk. You can do about 4 cups in a quart jar. I found the rice. I think it's a little bit less of the beans, but it's not going to be in bulk. So why would I do it? Well, for several reasons. One, I've already said it's not actually canning. You're repackaging it. So I'm repackaging it into these glass mason jars. This is going to protect it from getting bugs that may be introduced later on a shelf if it's sitting there in the bag. Now another way I've showed the 5-gallon buckets, you could store it like that or just on the shelf in a bag. However, if it's like this is susceptible to getting rodents gnawing on it or little bugs getting into it later on. And so by canning it or storing it in the mason jar, I am taking away that opportunity for bugs and rodents and things to get in there. So it's much more protected. Another thing I'm going to be doing is bringing it up to a heat at about 250 degrees. And so what that's going to do is kill any little bugs or larvae that may be in here. I know that sounds gross, and odds are you're not going to have any in yours, but if you're getting food from certain stores, maybe in bulk or things like that, there is a slight chance you may have some bug larvae or even little bugs in your food. We haven't had that happen to us yet, but I've heard many stories. So there's several things you can do. And other means of storing food that I'll talk about in a minute, we put our rice or beans or dry goods like that in the freezer. So by putting my dry goods in the deep freeze, it's going to kill off any little bugs or larvae in there. I want to throw it in the deep freezer where I got space for about 3 days. And after 3 days, we're going to pull it out, and you want to let it dry out for a couple days until it's completely dry. And so we'll do that. In dry canning, you don't want to do that. You can, if you do it, you want to let it dry out completely for several days at least before you attempt to dry can it. Again, you don't want any added moisture. It needs to be below 10%. So with putting it in the oven at that 250 degrees, we're going to kill off any larvae or bugs or anything that may be in there. Hopefully not, but anything that may, it will kill it. So we're keeping it away from any pests that may be introduced later by storing it in the jar, and then we're killing off any pests or anything that may be in it already. Another thing dry canning it in the jar is good for, like this, is it keeps it protected. So if there's going to be a flood or I don't know, other things like that happen, it's in the jar. So if it's just going to be in a bag or a cardboard box or something on your shelf and that gets wet, rained, flooded, or I guess this could probably survive a fire up to a little bit or other things like that, it's going to survive a lot better in these jars. So I do keep some of our jars of dried canned goods on hand. I do believe redundancy is important, and these are going to be more so for long-term storage. I'm not going to be getting into it all the time if it's dry canned. These are going to sit in a box with a bunch of them on the shelf as a redundant food source. Also, this is a good one as a food that you can give away to someone in a small portion. So those are some of the reasons that you may want to dry can, or we do. Some of the reasons you may not want to. And I want to point out, here I have some of my hard red winter wheat berries. So by dry canning, we're introducing it to a heat. So obviously that is going to take down the viability of regrowing it quite a bit. So with this hard red winter wheat, I can store it on the shelf via other means and not introduce it to that heat. And so then I could take some of this, I could grind it, cook it, eat it like this, or I can plant it. By introducing it to that heat, I pretty much take away the chance of me planting it. So that's one reason you may not want to. Another reason I mentioned before that people are really concerned about is the botulism forming. Now, it's safe to do if you do your own research. But in small portions like this, you're going to use foods that are very, very dry, less than 10% already. We're going to bring it up to heat and dry our jars, sterilize them, all in a way that is going to aid to that moisture-free as possible environment. Another reason that people say not to do it is dry canning doesn't remove the oxygen. So traditional canning is going to remove the oxygen. It's going to boil up and create heat in that jar, and then the lid pops back down. So it removes the oxygen from the jar, and that is something that can lead to molds or different things in the jar. I add a oxygen absorber to the process too. Today's video, I'm going to be showing you the process we use of dry canning and what I feel works best for us. Before I get there, I did want to just briefly cover a couple other means of preserving food, and these will be in other videos that you can see from us. But one of the reasons we do, or you'd want to dry can foods like this, is with dry goods like the beans, the rice. If you don't want to can that traditional way in the water and where it's going to be, soggy, moist. You still want it dry. This is a reason we would do it this way. Another way you can accomplish that, though, would be by vacuum sealing. So here I have some vacuum sealed rice in a mylar, and then some in a vacuum seal bag here. These are great. These will sit on the shelf. These can last for a very long time. These are ones I would use the method of putting it in the freezer first to kill any insects, and then pulling it out, letting it dry all the way. For another video, check that out. Getting on to today's video and showing you how we dry can some of our goods. First, I'm going to need a dried good. So we're going to be using pinto beans I have here. And so these have been sitting in the 5-gallon tub and they're ready to go. The other thing we're going to need is some mason jars. I think wide mouth works best. Some new lids and rings. And step 1, we need to clean all of our jars, lids, rings, and utensils and get them prepared to sanitize. So I got my jars nice and clean and rinsed really well. Make sure there's no soap in there. Cleaning them's great, but you gotta sanitize them as well. The way we're gonna do that is in the oven. So I got my oven here, it's heated up to 250 degrees. I have a baking pan, I just put some parchment paper. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put my jars right onto the pan. I like to put them open side up, that way they can dry out. By putting them in the oven here, we are not only going to sanitize them, but we're also going to dry them out really well. You remember, you don't want any moisture in any of the dry canning. And we're going to go ahead and leave these in the oven at 250 degrees for 15 minutes to get them sterile. Alright, while our jars are in the oven sterilizing, let's talk about the lids a little bit. So our lids here, these are just your normal ball lids that come with the jars, or you can buy separate. You can also get the Tatler, I believe it is, lids that can be reused. Those ones you can't use in this process, so you'll be using these regular lids. Normally you would put these in a pot of boiling water that gets up to about 212 degrees in order to sanitize them. Now with doing dry canning, you can't do that. You don't want to do that because that has the possibility of adding some extra moisture to the jar, to the product, whatever you have there, and you don't want that at all. So instead of boiling them in water to sanitize them, we're just going to go ahead and put them here in a dish. And we'll put this dish in the oven in the last 15 minutes of the baking process. So when we get to it, we'll talk about that there. So for this particular canning, I'm going to be doing pinto beans. And it's easiest if you go through and pick out any little rocks or bad ones and kind of clean it out first before you can it. So I'm going to go through this whole bowl here and get out any less than desirable ones. And that's 15 minutes. Next, step 3, time to fill our jars. So I'm going to take my towel and just lay it here. And we're going to pull our jars out of the oven. They should be completely dry and sterilized now. And we're going to pull them out one at a time, place them on the jar, and fill them. And then in the dry canning process, just like in traditional canning, you want to make sure you leave that inch of headspace between the top of the jar and the top of whatever food you have in there. That way you can make sure you're going to get a good seal. Once I got my jar full, I'm going to go ahead and place that back in the oven, pull out the next jar, and repeat the process. Now that we got our jars filled and back in the oven, we're going to let those bake for 30 minutes at 250 degrees. Cool. So we're about halfway through our 30-minute baking process here, or 30-minute process, and have about 15 minutes left to go. So in this last 15 minutes, this is where we're going to sterilize those lids. So we got our well-cleaned, well-rinsed lids, and I just got them in a baking dish. We're going to throw those in the oven for the remaining 15 minutes. Looks like we are just about at the end of our process here. So I want to mention something I do that not necessarily other people do. I like to do it just as an extra added step for some peace of mind, and that is to add a oxygen absorber. I don't want to add a moisture absorber or a moisture and oxygen absorber. It won't work, but a good oxygen absorber will help remove any remaining oxygen out of that jar. And I'll leave down in the description a website you guys can check out, and it has a great chart that you can find exactly what size oxygen absorber you'll need for your jar size and your project. I want to remove my rings and lids first. Those should be nice and sterilized. We'll set those aside. And then I'm going to take the jars out one at a time. And with one jar out, I'm going to throw my oxygen absorbers in there. With any canning, I do want to just wipe the rim off with a moist paper towel. You don't want to add moisture, so be careful with doing this. But we'll just wipe that clean, let it dry for a quick second, and then we can place our lid on and our ring. And their rings aren't too hot. I'm just going to finger tighten that. And we're going to set that to the side and let that cool down. So hopefully you heard that sound, and what that sound was one of these lids sealing. This one here. So as these cool down, they will seal and we'll be good to go. So this is just another great way you can store some of your dried goods. As long as they are dried goods and have no moisture in them and done correctly, this can be a great way to keep your dried goods safe from pests and elements and on the shelf for years to come, for a time you may need them. If you guys like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and you might like one of the videos below. So check out this one below here on cold smoked salts.